but only the surface of something far more calculated unfolding behind palace walls. Because while the world focused on headlines, inside Sandringham, a far colder conversation was quietly reaching a point of no return. Behind the heavy silence of royal estates, far away from cameras and commentary panels, a strategy was beginning to take shape, one not driven by emotion, but by survival. This was no longer about strained family ties or public disagreements. It had moved into something far more dangerous, something institutional. And at the center of that shift stood Prince William and Princess Anne, no longer observing, but actively reshaping the monarchy's response. Because from their perspective, the situation had crossed a line that could not be undone. The comparison that kept resurfacing inside those private discussions was not subtle. It was direct, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. Prince Andrew had already established a precedent. A senior royal, removed from public duty, stripped of roles, and effectively erased from institutional life when his actions threatened the crown's credibility. That precedent was never meant to be isolated. It was a blueprint. And now, that blueprint was being reopened. The argument being built inside the palace was stark in its logic. If a younger brother of the king could be removed for bringing reputational damage through personal conduct, then what happens when a younger son is perceived to be challenging the institution itself on a global stage? Not privately, not quietly, but repeatedly, publicly, and commercially. This is where the tone shifted. Because the concern was no longer about embarrassment. It was about value, specifically the value of the royal title. The fear emerging among palace strategists was simple but powerful. If royal titles could be used freely as branding tools, while simultaneously being leveraged to criticize the monarchy, then the title itself would begin to lose its meaning. And once that erosion begins, it does not stop. For Prince William, this was not theoretical. It was personal, but also deeply strategic. He was not looking at the present moment. He was looking ahead to his future reign, and beyond that, to the long-term position of Prince George. From that perspective, allowing the current situation to continue unchecked was not tolerance. It was risk. And risk, in an institution built on continuity, is something that gets eliminated. Inside these discussions, the framing became increasingly precise. The issue was no longer framed as a family dispute involving Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. It was reframed as a structural threat. The distinction mattered, because once something is categorized as a structural threat, the response becomes systematic, not emotional. That is when the language hardened. There were growing concerns about how royal identity was being used outside the institution. Commercial deals, media productions, public appearances, all of them still carrying the weight of royal association, even while the narrative surrounding the monarchy itself was being openly challenged. To palace traditionalists, this created a contradiction that could not be sustained. You cannot, in their view, operate as both critic and beneficiary of the same system without consequences. And that contradiction is what began to push discussions toward something far more definitive. At the center of it all stood King Charles III, facing a dilemma that was as personal as it was constitutional. On one side was the enduring belief that royal identity, once given by birth, should not be revoked. On the other side was mounting pressure from within his own institution, presenting a very different argument, that preserving the monarchy itself required difficult, even irreversible decisions. Because the timing made everything more urgent. With international engagements approaching, particularly high-profile appearances on the global stage, the monarchy could not afford competing narratives operating at the same level of visibility. The risk was not just distraction. It was dilution. If multiple versions of royal authority appeared simultaneously, especially across different continents and platforms, the clarity of the institution would begin to fracture. And once fractured, it becomes harder to control. What intensified the situation further was the perception of intent. Internally, certain actions were no longer being interpreted as isolated or accidental. They were being analyzed as patterns. Patterns that, when aligned with key royal events or sensitive periods, began to look increasingly strategic. This is where the emotional tone inside the palace shifted into something far more clinical. Because once intent is assumed, response escalates. The idea quietly taking shape was not immediate punishment, but controlled restriction. Not removal of identity, but removal of function. a distinction that allowed the monarchy to preserve tradition on the surface, while redefining its practical boundaries underneath. In simple terms, the conversation was no longer about who someone is by birth. It was about what they are allowed to represent. And that shift changes everything. What was being discussed behind closed doors was not dramatic in appearance, but it was profound in consequence. A future where titles could remain technically intact, but stripped of operational power. Where association with the monarchy would exist biologically, but not institutionally. Where the difference between being royal and representing royalty would become sharply defined. This was not a temporary measure. This was a recalibration. And as those discussions continued, one thing became increasingly clear. The palace was no longer asking whether action would be taken. That question had already been answered. The only uncertainty that remained was how far that action would go, and how much of the royal identity could be reshaped without breaking the institution itself. Because for the first time in years, the monarchy was not reacting. It was preparing. And once preparation reaches that stage, the outcome is rarely reversible. If the quiet calculations inside Sandringham felt distant and almost abstract, what unfolded thousands of miles away in Australia transformed that strategy into something urgent, visible, and impossible to ignore. Because while the palace was still debating structure and consequence, the streets of Sydney were already delivering what insiders would later describe as the final piece of evidence. This was no longer theory. This was proof. What had been presented publicly as a humanitarian-style re-engagement quickly began to look very different when examined through the lens of the institution. The tour carried all the familiar signals: charity visits, public appearances, carefully framed interactions. But beneath that surface, a second layer was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Private filming crews, controlled narratives, and a level of production that suggested something far beyond simple service. Inside palace circles, this triggered a very specific concern. Because the monarchy has always operated on one core principle: service must appear authentic, not transactional. The moment that perception shifts, the entire foundation begins to weaken. And what was being observed in Australia raised exactly that fear. Not because of a single event, but because of the pattern those events created when placed side by side. At the center of that scrutiny were Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, whose presence in the Commonwealth country was no longer being viewed as symbolic or supportive. Instead, it was being interpreted through a far more critical lens, one that questioned intent, timing, and ultimately purpose. The issue escalated quickly when public perception began to shift. Reports emerging from Sydney and Melbourne indicated growing frustration, not just among commentators, but among ordinary citizens. The confusion surrounding funding, security, and the broader purpose of the visit created a narrative that the palace could not afford to ignore. A petition gaining tens of thousands of signatures demanding clarity over taxpayer involvement was not just a political inconvenience. It was a signal. And signals like that are taken seriously. Because once public trust begins to erode in Commonwealth nations, the impact is not localized. It spreads. It influences debates about relevance, cost, and the very role of the monarchy in modern society. For Prince William, this was exactly the scenario he had been warning about. Not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, visible weakening of credibility in places where the crown's symbolic authority still mattered. This is where the internal narrative hardened further. The Australian situation was no longer viewed as an isolated controversy. It became a case study. A demonstration of what happens when royal identity operates without institutional control. And once framed that way, it justified a stronger response. Particularly from Princess Anne, whose role in these discussions had become increasingly influential. Known within royal circles for her uncompromising approach to duty, she reportedly viewed the events in Australia not as missteps, but as a direct violation of what royal service is supposed to represent. Her perspective was blunt. Every public interaction that appears transactional weakens every interaction that is genuine. That distinction mattered more than anything else. Because the monarchy does not compete on visibility. It competes on trust. And if that trust begins to blur, if people start to question whether service is real or staged, then even the most carefully maintained traditions begin to lose their impact. What made the situation even more sensitive was the symbolism involved. Australia is not just another location. It is part of the Commonwealth, a structure that relies heavily on perception, loyalty, and shared identity. Any controversy unfolding there carries a different weight, a different level of scrutiny. And when that controversy involves members of the royal family operating outside official roles, the lines become even more complicated. That complexity is what pushed the palace toward urgency. Because at the same time, King Charles III was preparing for major international engagements, including appearances that required absolute clarity in representation. The monarchy could not afford competing narratives unfolding simultaneously, one official, one unofficial, especially when both carried global visibility. From a strategic standpoint, the risk was clear. If the public begins to see multiple versions of the monarchy, the authority of the official one begins to weaken. And once that perception takes hold, it is incredibly difficult to reverse. The Australian developments also introduced a second layer of concern: commercialization. Reports suggesting high-priced events, exclusive gatherings, and branded experiences linked to royal association raised questions that went beyond optics. They touched on something deeper: the idea that royal identity itself was being converted into a marketable product. For palace traditionalists, this crossed a line. Because historically, the monarchy has maintained a strict separation between duty and commerce. That separation is not accidental. It is what protects the institution from being perceived as self-serving. Once that boundary is blurred, the monarchy risks becoming just another brand competing for attention. And that is precisely what it has always tried to avoid. Inside Sandringham, these concerns were no longer hypothetical discussions. They were being mapped, documented, and connected. The Australian tour became a central reference point, a real-world example used to justify structural change. Not because of one decision, but because of the cumulative effect of many. What had once been tolerated as individual initiatives was now being re-evaluated as a pattern of behavior. And patterns, once identified, demand response. This is where the tone inside the palace shifted from cautious to decisive. The question was no longer whether boundaries needed to be defined. It was how quickly they could be enforced without creating further instability. Because every day that passed without clarity allowed the situation to expand, to evolve, and potentially to cause more damage. Timing, in this context, became everything. With global attention already building around upcoming royal engagements, the monarchy needed to act before competing narratives could take hold. It needed to establish a clear line between official representation and private activity, one that could not be misinterpreted or blurred. And that line, once drawn, would not just affect the present moment. It would redefine the rules going forward. Because what Australia exposed was not just a controversy. It was a vulnerability. A gap between tradition and modern reality that could no longer be ignored. And once that gap became visible, the institution had only two choices: adapt, or risk losing control of its own identity. By the time those discussions concluded, one thing had become unmistakably clear. The events in Australia were not the problem. They were the trigger. And what followed would not be about damage control. It would be about transformation. If Australia exposed the vulnerability, what unfolded next in the United States confirmed something even more unsettling for the palace: the loss of influence where it mattered most. Because while the monarchy was still calculating risk, the marketplace had already delivered its verdict, and it was far harsher than anything discussed behind closed doors. This was no longer about perception alone. This was about collapse. In the boardrooms of Los Angeles and the executive floors of New York, a quiet shift had been taking place, one that rarely announces itself loudly but leaves unmistakable consequences. Deals that once symbolized independence and global reach were beginning to unravel, not with dramatic headlines, but with subtle distancing, delayed projects, and eventually, silence. At the center of that unraveling stood Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, whose post-royal strategy had been built on a single assumption: that global relevance could be sustained without institutional backing. For a time, that assumption appeared valid. Major partnerships, high-value contracts, and international visibility created the image of a parallel power structure. But the durability of that structure was always uncertain. And now, that uncertainty was becoming visible. The most telling signal did not come from critics or commentators. It came from within the industry itself. When partnerships begin to dissolve not because of controversy, but because of perceived lack of value, the message is unmistakable. The system is no longer invested. That is what began to emerge. The collapse of key deals, particularly with platforms like Spotify and Netflix, was not interpreted inside the palace as isolated business decisions. It was seen as a pattern that suggested something fundamental had shifted in how the couple was perceived, not just by audiences, but by those funding the platforms themselves. And that shift carried strategic implications. Because for the monarchy, influence has always been a form of soft power. It does not operate through contracts or commercial metrics. It operates through continuity, symbolism, and long-term credibility. The moment influence becomes tied to market performance, it becomes unstable. It rises quickly, but it can fall even faster. This is exactly what palace strategists believed they were witnessing. Inside Sandringham, the narrative began to change once again. What had initially been framed as a threat driven by visibility was now being reframed as something far more fragile, a system dependent on attention and therefore vulnerable to decline. The distinction mattered because it altered the risk calculation. A powerful rival requires containment. A weakening one requires timing. This is where Prince William's position became increasingly influential. His argument was no longer based solely on protecting the monarchy from attack. It evolved into something more strategic, preventing the monarchy from being dragged down alongside a declining brand. Because if the Sussex identity began to lose value in the commercial world while still carrying royal association, the damage would not remain isolated. It would reflect back onto the institution itself. Titles, in that scenario, would not just be misused. They would be devalued. And devaluation, once it begins, is extremely difficult to reverse. This concern was reinforced by Princess Anne, whose perspective remained grounded in institutional discipline. From her point of view, the marketplace was not just reacting. It was revealing. Revealing what happens when royal identity is removed from duty and placed into a commercial environment without structure. The result, in her assessment, was inevitable. Without the framework of the monarchy, the identity loses its anchor. And once unanchored, it drifts. What intensified the situation further was the growing perception gap between expectation and reality. Early announcements had positioned the couple as global storytellers, cultural influencers, and independent voices with significant reach. But over time, the output did not match the scale of those expectations. Inside the palace, this gap was not dismissed as a normal business fluctuation. It was analyzed as a credibility issue. Because credibility, once questioned, affects everything that follows. This is where the internal discussions began to incorporate a new layer: risk amplification. The idea that a declining external brand, still linked to the monarchy, could amplify negative perception more than a stable or successful one. It was not just about what was happening. It was about how it was being interpreted. And interpretation, in the modern media environment, spreads faster than fact. The situation also introduced a behavioral dimension that the palace could not ignore. Reports of attempts to maintain visibility within elite circles, high-profile events, industry gatherings, and social appearances were being interpreted not as strategic networking, but as signs of diminishing access. Because in those environments, presence is not enough. Relevance must be sustained. When relevance begins to fade, the response often becomes more visible, more urgent, and sometimes more noticeable than intended. This creates a feedback loop, where the effort to maintain influence becomes evidence of its decline. Inside Sandringham, this pattern was being carefully observed, not out of curiosity, but out of calculation. Because timing, once again, became critical. If action was taken too early, it could be interpreted as reactionary or punitive. But if taken at the moment when external influence was already declining, it could be framed as alignment, aligning the institution with a reality that was already visible to the public. This distinction was crucial. It allowed the monarchy to act without appearing aggressive, to reposition without appearing defensive, to redefine without appearing reactive. At the center of this strategic recalibration stood King Charles III, whose role had shifted from observer to decision-maker under increasing pressure. The arguments presented to him were no longer hypothetical. They were supported by timelines, market data, public sentiment, and comparative analysis. This was not emotional persuasion. This was structured reasoning. and the conclusion being built was clear. The monarchy could not allow its identity to be tied to a model that was losing credibility in real time. It could not risk being perceived as part of a system that depended on controversy for relevance. And it could not maintain ambiguity in roles when that ambiguity was being actively exploited. Something had to be defined. Something had to be separated. And something had to be controlled. What made this moment particularly significant was the shift in power dynamics within the palace itself. The influence of Prince William and Princess Anne was no longer advisory. It was directive. Their approach, focused, disciplined, and unapologetically institutional, was beginning to shape the final outcome. This was not about restoring balance. This was about enforcing it. Because for the first time, the palace was not dealing with a rising challenge. It was dealing with a declining one that still carried symbolic weight. And that combination is uniquely dangerous. By the end of these discussions, one realization had fully taken hold inside Sandringham. The issue was no longer whether the Sussex model could succeed or fail on its own. The issue was whether the monarchy would allow itself to be affected by that outcome. And once that question was asked, the answer became inevitable. Separation was no longer a possibility. It was a necessity. If the marketplace collapse exposed weakness and Australia exposed vulnerability, what unfolded next inside Sandringham revealed something far more decisive. The internal balance of power had shifted, and with it, the entire direction of the monarchy's response. Because this was no longer a discussion. It had become a takeover of strategy. Inside those closed rooms, the tone had changed in a way that even longtime palace observers would have recognized as significant. The language of reconciliation, which had quietly lingered in earlier phases, was no longer driving the conversation. In its place stood something far more precise, far more controlled, and far less forgiving. A doctrine built not on family repair, but on institutional preservation. At the center of that shift stood Prince William, no longer positioned as a future monarch observing from the sidelines, but as an active force shaping the present. His approach was not emotional, and it was not reactive. It was structured, almost clinical, grounded in a single principle that began to dominate the discussions. The monarchy survives only if its boundaries are enforced. This principle sounds simple, but within the context of the royal family, it carries enormous weight. Because enforcing boundaries within an institution built on bloodlines requires a level of detachment that few are willing to exercise. Yet that is exactly what William was reportedly pushing for. A clear separation between identity and function, between being born into the institution and being allowed to represent it. And once that line is drawn, everything changes. Supporting that position with equal intensity was Princess Anne, whose role inside these discussions had evolved into something closer to a constitutional anchor, where William provided forward-looking strategy and reinforced it with precedent, discipline, and an unshakable commitment to the rules that have historically protected the monarchy from internal erosion. Her argument was not built on speculation. It was built on history. The reference point, once again, returned to Prince Andrew, not as a comparison of circumstances, but as a demonstration of capability. The monarchy had already proven that it could remove a senior royal from functional life when the institution required it. That action, once taken, had redefined what was possible. And now, that possibility was being expanded. Because the situation involving Prince Harry and Meghan Markle was no longer being measured against past standards. It was being evaluated as a new category entirely. One that combined public criticism, commercial activity, and sustained global visibility. In other words, a challenge that was not just internal, but external and ongoing. This is where the doctrine began to take form. Inside Sandringham, the discussions moved toward a model that could be applied consistently, not just to the present situation, but to any future scenario that resembled it. A model that would define, in clear terms, what it means to be a working royal, and more importantly, what happens when that role is abandoned but the identity remains. The answer being shaped was both simple and far-reaching. You may remain who you are by birth, but you lose the right to represent what you no longer serve. This distinction became the foundation of the emerging strategy, because it allowed the monarchy to maintain its traditional stance, acknowledging lineage, respecting history, while simultaneously asserting control over its modern function. It created a framework where identity could not be weaponized without consequence, where association did not automatically grant authority. And for William and Anne, this was essential, because their concern was not limited to the present moment. It extended into the future, into how the monarchy would operate in an era defined by media, branding, and constant visibility. If boundaries were not enforced now, they would become impossible to enforce later. That future, in their view, centered heavily on Prince George, because everything being decided in that room would eventually shape the environment he inherits. A monarchy where titles are tightly controlled, clearly defined, and protected from dilution is fundamentally different from one where those titles can be used freely across competing narratives. This is why the tone became so uncompromising, because from their perspective, this was not just a response. It was a correction. And corrections, by nature, are rarely comfortable. At the center of all of this remained King Charles III, whose position had become increasingly complex. He was no longer simply weighing options. He was being presented with a consolidated strategy, one that had been shaped, refined, and reinforced by those closest to the future of the monarchy. The pressure was not loud, but it was constant. Not emotional, but logical. And perhaps most importantly, not temporary. Because the arguments being made were not about resolving a situation. They were about preventing a pattern from repeating. They were about ensuring that what had unfolded over the past few years could not be replicated by anyone else in the future. That is what gave the discussions their intensity. Because once a pattern is identified, ignoring it becomes a choice. And that choice carries consequences. What also emerged during this phase was a growing recognition that ambiguity itself had become a liability. For too long, the lines between official duty and private activity had remained blurred, allowing multiple interpretations to coexist. That ambiguity had initially provided flexibility, but over time, it had created confusion. And confusion, in an institution built on clarity, is dangerous. The solution being proposed was not incremental. It was definitive. A clear, enforceable distinction between those who represent the crown and those who do not. A structure that leaves no room for interpretation, no space for dual roles, no opportunity for overlap. Either you operate within the institution, under its rules and expectations, or you operate entirely outside of it. But not both. This was the essence of the William and Doctrine. And once established, it began to reshape everything around it. Because it was not just about one couple. It was about setting a precedent that would define the monarchy's relationship with modern media, global influence, and personal autonomy moving forward. It was about ensuring that the institution could adapt without losing control of its identity. And perhaps most significantly, it was about signaling that the era of flexibility had limits. That the monarchy, despite its long history of patience and gradual change, was still capable of drawing a line and holding it. By the time this phase of the discussions reached its conclusion, one reality had become undeniable inside Sandringham. The strategy was no longer fragmented. It was unified. And once unity is achieved at that level, implementation is no longer a question of if. It becomes a matter of when. Because the institution had made its decision. Not publicly, not yet. But internally, the outcome was already set. And what would follow would not feel like a reaction. It would feel like a resolution. If everything up to this point was preparation, alignment, and internal consolidation, then what came next was the moment where theory turned into structure, where quiet discussions inside Sandringham translated into something far more permanent, far more controlled, and far more difficult to reverse. Because this was no longer about influence. This was about law. Inside the final phase of deliberations, the tone shifted once again, but this time into something unmistakably precise. The language of strategy gave way to the language of constitutional authority. Legal advisors, private secretaries, and institutional experts moved into position, not to debate what should happen, but to define exactly how it would happen, and more importantly, how it would be enforced. At the center of it all stood King Charles III, no longer balancing perspectives, but preparing to exercise one of the most powerful tools available to the monarchy: the ability to redefine how royal identity functions within the modern state. Because while titles may carry history, their usage carries rules. And those rules can be rewritten. The approach being finalized did not rely on dramatic gestures or public confrontation. Instead, it focused on something far more effective: restriction without removal. A method that allows the monarchy to preserve tradition on the surface while fundamentally altering its practical application underneath. This distinction is critical, because removing a title entirely invites political complexity, parliamentary involvement, and public debate. Restricting its usage, however, remains within the sovereign's control. It is quieter, cleaner, and far more difficult to challenge. And that is exactly the path being shaped. Under this emerging framework, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle would not be stripped of identity in a traditional sense. Instead, the functional power of that identity would be systematically removed. Titles would exist, but without operational value. Recognition would remain, but without institutional authority. In effect, the difference between being royal and acting as a royal would be permanently separated. This is where the strategy becomes particularly significant, because it does not erase the past. It redefines the present. One of the most consequential elements under consideration involved the complete restriction of commercial usage. Any association between royal titles and business activity, whether through branding, marketing, or representation, would be prohibited. This would extend across industries, platforms, and jurisdictions, creating a uniform boundary that could not be bypassed through interpretation. For palace strategists, this was essential, because the modern risk was not just reputational. It was commercial. The monarchy's symbolic authority, if converted into a marketable asset without oversight, becomes vulnerable to dilution. And once diluted, it loses the very quality that makes it valuable: its exclusivity. By enforcing a strict separation between title and commerce, the institution protects that exclusivity. At the same time, another layer of restructuring was being finalized, one that addressed representation on the global stage. Moving forward, the monarchy would operate under a far more defined model, where only officially designated members could act on behalf of the crown in any diplomatic, ceremonial, or symbolic capacity. This clarity was not optional. It was necessary. Because in an era of global media, overlapping narratives create confusion faster than they can be corrected. If multiple figures appear to represent the monarchy simultaneously, especially across different continents, the institution's authority becomes fragmented. And fragmentation leads to instability. By establishing a single controlled line of representation, centered around King Charles III, Prince William, and the immediate working structure, the monarchy ensures consistency. It ensures that when the crown speaks, it speaks with one voice, not several. Another critical component of this framework involved digital and institutional presence. The monarchy's official platforms, websites, records, and public-facing materials would be updated to reflect the new structure. This was not merely symbolic. In the modern era, digital presence defines public understanding. It shapes perception, establishes hierarchy, and reinforces legitimacy. By controlling that space, the monarchy controls its narrative. And narrative, as this entire situation has demonstrated, is everything. The implications of this restructuring extend far beyond the individuals involved. They establish a precedent, a model that can be applied in future scenarios where personal independence intersects with institutional identity. A clear message that the monarchy is willing to adapt, but only on its own terms. That adaptation is not about becoming modern for the sake of relevance. It is about remaining controlled in an environment that constantly pushes for exposure. At a deeper level, this moment represents something even more profound. It marks the transition from a monarchy that tolerates ambiguity to one that defines its boundaries with precision. From an institution that absorbs tension to one that redirects it. From a system that reacts to events to one that anticipates and structures them. And at the center of that transformation is a single decision: to prioritize the crown over the individual, not out of hostility, but out of necessity. Because institutions that fail to protect their core identity do not evolve. They dissolve. As this phase concludes, the weight of what has been set in motion becomes increasingly clear. This is not a temporary adjustment. It is a recalibration of how the monarchy operates in a world where visibility, influence, and identity are constantly being redefined. And once recalibrated, it does not easily return to its previous state. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, this signals a future where their connection to the monarchy exists in history, not in function. A future where identity remains, but authority does not. Where recognition persists, but representation is no longer permitted. For the monarchy, however, it signals something different. Clarity, control, continuity. Because in the end, this was never just about a single situation. It was about defining what the monarchy is and what it refuses to become. And that definition, once established, becomes its strongest form of protection. Now here's the question that changes everything, and I want you to think about it carefully. If a monarchy built on centuries of tradition is willing to redraw its own boundaries this sharply, does that make it stronger for the future, or does it risk losing the very humanity that made people believe in it in the first place? Because that tension, between control and connection, is where the Real story begins. If you've made it this far, you already understand this isn't just another royal headline. This is a turning point. So tell me what you think, because your perspective matters more than ever. And if you want the next breakdown, the deeper layer behind what happens after this decision becomes public, stay with me. Because the next part changes how this entire story is remembered.